Welcome, voice friends, to another episode of Interviews on Voice Matters. My name is Liz Johnson, and I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee with Anne Karpf, who is in London, correct?
It is. I am, yes.
London. Joining us today to talk about a great deal of work that she's done on the human voice. She has written a book called The Human Voice. Here's my copy, my advanced reading copy that I happened to get at Powell's bookstore in Portland, Oregon, many, many years ago. It was just a grab off the shelf, looked interesting. It was with the other voice books, and it's turned out to be quite a treasure trove of information and very helpful in my practice. And today we're just going to talk about how the book came to be and why you decided to write about such a subject. Now, Anne, I have to say, the biggest reason I wanted to talk to you today is because I started looking into who you were and what kind of work you did, completely assuming that you were a voice researcher or your whole life was dedicated to voice like many of us. And no, in fact, you have a range of topics that you've written on and you have a range of work that you've looked into. But for someone who knows as much about the voice as you do, it's overwhelming that you're a journalist, a sociologist, a writer, and you have this passion for voice. It just surprised me that you were not completely 100% dedicated to the voice. So my first question to you is, how did you get interested in writing about the human voice?
Yes, people always ask me that question. So I've thought quite a bit about it down the years. There's no one single answer. I think there are a lot of answers. There are kind of pretty obvious answers, like I was a radio critic for a number of years. I was the radio critic of The Guardian, so I was British national newspaper. I was very attuned to the voice in that sense. My sister is a voiceover actress. So, she's voiced, anything and everything from Harry Potter video games to movies to radio. So that sort of brought me in contact with the voice. But I think there were two other reasons. One is that my parents were not British. Well, they became British, but they were born in Poland. They were both Holocaust survivors who came to Britain after the war, 1947. And they learned English the same time as we learned English, me and my sister. So in some sense, words had less meaning than the voice, because although they ended up speaking very good English and they were trilingual, they spoke Polish, German and English fluently, and my father wrote beautifully in English, they obviously didn't have quite the same command, particularly when we were small, of the language. So the voice became increasingly important, I think, in identifying and distinguishing what they were trying to say, interpreting what was really going on. And I think a lot wasn't articulated through words, but through the voice. And the other thing was, I became aware over a number of years, because as you say, unfortunately, I do have many wide interests and I dart from one thing to another, which you're not really meant to do these days. You're meant to just stay in one field. But it became apparent to me that there had been a lot of work done on conversation, for example, on linguistic differences. Mm-hmm. All of these seem to ignore the vehicle, the medium through which language is expressed, which is the voice. And I just couldn't understand why there was this absence. Now, when I say absence, you'll see by the enormous number of footnotes at the end of my book that there has been a lot of scholarly research done, but it seemed to me that there wasn't a language in kind of popular discourse, if you like, in kind of everyday life to talk about the voice. And this was borne out for me when I started doing interviews for the voice, because I did, for this book, I did 50 interviews in the UK and the US with people about voices. And when I started doing one interview with a very educated, intelligent woman, and I asked her what her feelings were about her own voice and the voices of people close to her. And she looked at me as if I was talking, a different language. And she said to me, I've never given that subject a moment's thought. And then there was a pause for a few seconds. And then she started, and she couldn't stop talking about the voice. And so I began to feel more and more that actually people had very strong feelings about voices. They were very sensitive to other people's voices and their own voice, but they didn't have a shared language anymore to speak about it. And I say anymore because, you know, the whole idea, the orthodoxy nowadays is that we are a visual culture where the image or the written text are more important than orality. And I felt instinctively this wasn't true from my own experience and other people's experience. So all these things together made me feel that this was an area that somehow we needed to address in an accessible way. And then when I started to look at the research, of course, there is so much fascinating research being done about the voice. So I was trying to bring it together, but really it was a folly because it's such a huge subject and fascinating, absolutely fascinating to me. And I remain fascinated by it, but it was a bit of a large subject to take on.
Yeah, it seems that there are 3 dissertations, part 1, 2, and 3 of the book. How did you come to organize all that information?
Oh gosh, well, with some difficulty. I mean, I think one of the things that became apparent to me when I looked at all of the voice research, I mean, there is some fascinating research out there. There's also some very, very poor research out there. And it seems to me that the poorer the research, the more famous it had become. And there was a couple of studies by someone, I think he was at UCLA, Albert Mehrabian, whose work has become very, very famous. And he's worked out a kind of formula for how much of the meaning of a message is conveyed through gesture and visual, you know, things like hand signals like I'm using now, how much through the words and how much through the voice, but a very specific mathematical formula. And I was repeating this to someone one day and I stopped in the middle of it and I thought, but this is a nonsense. How could you possibly devise a mathematical formula that would be relevant to every single verbal interaction? And so I went and dug out the papers and looked at them again. And of course, they are based on the slenderest evidence. And the worst thing about them is they're not based on real one-to-one interactions. They're based on simulated discussion. And not even discussion. They take isolated words and they make speakers say them in a way to express like or dislike or neutrality. A few words, a handful of words. And then they make a handful of other people guess what emotion is being expressed, which, I mean, is the most kind of unscientific way you could possibly go about evaluating voice. So it seemed to me it was a nonsense. And it didn't take account of the fact that our voices change whoever we're speaking to, and there's an enormous body of evidence in what's called convergence or accommodation theory to show that. I mean, you know, my husband comes into the room, he can tell right away if I'm on the phone to my sister, you know, instantly, because my voice changes. And it's the same for all of us. So, you know, that's one basic thing. And, you know, and the fact is that most of us never express one single emotion through our voices. We're expressing lots of different emotions at the same time. So I felt there was a kind of poverty in some of the better known research on the voice. And also that it didn't, one area that seemed to me woefully underdeveloped and unexplored is the whole area of our relationship with our own voice.
Right.
Right. You know, I actually wanted to call the book at one point, Do I Really Sound Like This? Because that's what everybody says. I mean, you'll know that better than people when they hear themselves recorded, as I will when I hear this recorded. And of course, there are all kinds of reasons for that. I mean, the ones that are usually given are that we hear our own voices conducted through the eustachian tubes and the bones of our skull, and other people hear them conducted through the air. And also that if you hear yourself recorded, it's mostly likely to be on a very kind of tinny digital recording equipment. But then I found this fascinating paper from the 1960s of 2 psychologists, who said, oh no, the reason people say, do I sound like that? Do I really sound like that? Is not because they don't recognize their own voices, because they recognize them all too well. And what they hear is the bit of their voice or the bit of them that they don't like and they thought they had sort of locked away, that kind of leaks out through their voice. And at that point, I thought, yes, I'm going to test that out by doing some interviews. Anyway, that's a very long answer to your question.
When did you start writing this book?
Oh my goodness. Well, I have a bad record of not beginning books. I mean, it stretched over quite a long period of time. I've got much better with my more recent books. My last book was delivered bang on time. But with that book, it took quite a long time. I mean, I was doing a lot of other things at the same time. But so I kind of started probably around the turn of the century, 2000. I can't remember when exactly I signed the contract. But I spent an awful lot of time just mulling it over, thinking about it. Then I broke my leg in the middle of it, so I was in hospital. That was actually quite useful because I spent some time reading more and really developing what I thought about things. But so on and off, I spent probably about 4 or 5 years on it. And since then, I've done a lot of other writing around the voice and given papers on the voice, and actually got my PhD by prior output. That means sort of retrospectively based on publication on the voice. So I've come at it from lots of different angles.
Was there a moment in time where you felt inspired to write the book, or was it just a gradual process?
Well, I mean, I just think it's just something so fascinating. And I think probably I've always been fascinated by it. And I know this is going to sound really cheesy, but I kind of started to feel that people who work around with the voice, the voice community, if you like, there's something rather wonderful about them. It does seem to attract really interesting people. And I say this as my husband is a sort of international expert on community radio. So he has a lot to say about the voice. So, there were so many different things that made me excited by it. And in this whole period, the other thing that has been for me has been that my own voice has changed a lot. I mean, at the beginning, partly that's to do with aging, and women's voices deepen with age. But partly, it's funny because when I interview people about their voices, of course, they became very self-conscious in replying to me because they were using the very instrument that I was asking them about. So some of them really just couldn't speak for a little bit. And at the beginning, I'd done quite a lot of work both then and since then on women's voices. And I certainly became very aware of a sort of disconnect in my own voice, which has changed, partly through writing the book, partly through having a lot of therapy, and partly through getting older and changing, becoming more joined up and connected as a person, so that my voice doesn't any longer feel like something that could let me down or betray me. It feels more like an asset which I can use.
Yes, exactly. And maybe that's why at moments in your book, I was brought to tears, because this is such an important subject, and it's something that we're all very intimately connected with, whether we realize it or not, and you're bringing that to light. And it reminds me of what you're saying, that this group of people that are interested in the voice, they're very passionate and they're very interested, and there's just so much energy around it. Like, you go to a voice conference and it's electric in the air, because everybody there has this fundamental love for the subject of voice.
I think that's exactly right. And what they will have in common is that they're very good at listening and paying attention. It's interesting. I just went with my daughter, one of my kids, to see the movie Lady Bird, and at one point the main character says, "I pay attention. I notice what's going on." And I think people who work with the voice are people who pay attention, because if you like, the visual world is so literally in your face. We're presented with it everywhere. It's inescapable. And it's it's much easier to tune out of the audio oral world, I think, than the visual world. And when you start paying audio attention, it somehow really grounds you in the moment much more.
Yes.
Because the voice is so fleeting, because you can't rewind it. Well, you can if you record it, but not in real time. Whereas a visual image you can look at repeatedly. So with the voice, if you don't pay attention, it's gone. It's about the moment. And so I think, I mean, it's a huge sweeping statement of generalization, but on the whole, I think people who work with the voice are people who pay attention.
That way, but you're exactly right.
I mean, I have such a rushed life. You know, I'm constantly rushing. It's very easy not to pay attention, but if you do, then I think the voice is very, very brings a lot of rewards.
Yeah, and that's what your book is doing for us, is helping us to refocus that conversation and to pay attention to what's going on around us. And you talk about everything from the psychology of the voice to the development of the voice to how technology has informed and changed our perception of voice to how we're subconsciously using the voice or consciously using the voice in politics and media and whatnot. All of these things are, I mean, each one of those individual subjects that I just mentioned is worthy of books and books and books written on them. So I kind of feel like your work is this gateway into a huge realm of voice research, should anyone want to go out and spend their lives on any one of these subjects. Who is your intended audience for the book?
Well, I very much wanted to address a non-specialist readership. I really wanted to address, you know, ordinary people. And I mean, at the end of the book, there's a huge wodge of footnotes, but I wrote it very much, I hope, in an accessible way, with humour and not using any jargon. So I really wanted as wide a readership as possible. As I say, there are a lot of very interesting and good books written for voice specialists, and I wasn't really trying to compete with them. I mean, obviously I brought my own research into it, and as a sociologist, and I'm particularly, I mean, my PhD is in the field of psychosocial studies, so I'm particularly interested in that point where the psychological and the social intersect, you know, how we are acculturated into the use of our voice. So I'm very interested in the gendered aspects of the voice, for example, how men and women are socialized into using their voices differently. And there's a very interesting piece of American research which shows that boys start to begin to use a lower register earlier than they are physiologically and anatomically determined to do so, you know, shaped. So in other words, something is happening with boys before puberty that is making them adopt a voice, a vocal range, that a register that is associated with adult males, but they're not, you know, they could speak in a different way if they wanted to, as it were. So, I mean, one has to assume that that's something to do with gender. And also then, I mean, I find the whole subject of women's voices so fascinating. I mean, you mentioned politics, and we now have a woman prime minister in Theresa May in the UK, who has a great deal of difficulty with her voice, who is unable to use her voice, as became apparent in the last general election, to connect with people. And the voice is an incredibly important part of making a connection with people. I mean, you can do an extraordinary amount just through the voice, as you will know very well, Liz. And she's not able to do that. And so what she does is she just tries to speak more and more emphatically. And it actually reduces the sensitivity of nuance in her voice. And she also has something which I can't give a name to, but you will undoubtedly be able to. I call it completely technical way, tears in the voice, so that it sounds to me, it's the kind of voice, and I'm not trying to psychologize someone who I've never met, but I recognize it in quite a number of people that I meet, somebody who sounds as if there's some grief trapped in their throat. And there is a kind of break in their voice that you can distinctly hear. But overall, there's somebody who really cannot use their voice in a way that would make them much more politically effective. And this is a liability. I mean, with Margaret Thatcher, I mean, she is generally assumed to have had coaching lessons to change her voice. Although I spoke to her PR man, and he told me that she hadn't, but that they had guided her a lot on her voice because she had a lot of difficulty with her voice. So I think it's a big challenge for female politicians.
Challenge for everyone, correct? Because we're getting so much information through the voice, but we don't necessarily realize that we are.
Exactly.
And that's why the conversation is so important. And one point that you bring up is that in some ways the voice is less important because of texting and email and all these other forms of nonverbal communication. But then again, the voice is also becoming more important, maybe because it's becoming more rare in some cases, or maybe because we are getting so much information we don't realize it. So we've got both and going on.
Well, that's true. And if you think of the kind of universality of the cell phone now, I mean, you know, not just in the West, in Africa now, you know, the spread of the cell phone, I mean, it has become such a major form of communication. So the idea that the voice is being eclipsed, I think doesn't stand up. I mean, yes, young people are texting a lot. I ask my students about this, and they all say, oh yeah, but we use texting to set up face-to-face encounters. We still value those. But then I was reading a piece of research the other day. I think I've got it here with me. Just have a look at this. Young people reluctant to converse face-to-face. This is a British study about young people 18 to 24, about 20 times more likely to never speak to their neighbours. And they would rather talk online to people they don't know rather than have a conversation face-to-face. Now, whether that is to do solely with not feeling comfortable with using their voice and being more comfortable with the anonymity of online, or whether that's got something to do with the nature of modern urban life and people feeling alienated from each other. I mean, it's probably a mixture of all of those. We don't know. But yes, my students say, though, that face-to-face encounters still are the most valuable for them. And while they obviously do a lot of online work, they kind of recognize the difference, which is heartening for you know, an old person like me.
When you were collecting your folks to interview for your book, how did you go about that?
Well, that's a very good question. And as a sociologist, really, it was a daunting task at the beginning with, because what are you going to, on what grounds are you going to select? How on earth are you going to get a representative sample, and of who, you know, of everyone who's got a voice, which is like everybody in the world? Obviously you can't. So I remembered something that happened when I was doing my master's, and my supervisor, when I was talking about my final project, which was about health, medicine and the media, and I was looking at medical television, and my supervisor said, well, you know, you need to talk to some individuals. I mean, I've got other form of audience research as well. And she said, why don't you, because I was looking at the making of a particular television series. She said, why don't you go and watch the first program with a family? And I said, what, one family? And she said, yes. And I said, how representative would that have been? And she said, but you're not claiming it's representative. And then I learned an essential lesson. It depends what you're claiming. You've got to match your methodology to the claims you make. So then that absolutely liberated me. It wasn't aiming to be representative of all speakers. And also, I tell my students in research, what's really important is getting access to people. So I actually decided that it would be an entirely random selection of people. I mean, I would try and balance it out as much as I could in terms of social class, gender, ethnicity, But in the end, I just thought all I want is to get a sense from a random group of people about how they feel about their own voices and the voices of people close to them. So how they start. I was interested in that interpretive process, because I felt that, I wish that I could have found some magic formula that said, these are the 5 ways you can tell if someone's lying. And of course, if I had been able to do that, I'd be a very wealthy woman. But of course I can't, because everybody's different. So what I was working on the basis that actually one gets to know the voices of people close to one's colleagues at work, one's family, one's relatives. One gets to know those voices very well, and therefore we are very sensitive to differences in those voices. We can pick up in a millimeter, a milliseconds pause, for example, or somebody just a fraction colder than usual. So I thought all I'm going to do is just ask a random selection of people what they feel about their own voices and what they feel about the voices of people close to them. And I mean, in some cases, it didn't produce much. In other cases, I mean, there was particularly one woman that I talk about in the book where, it elicited a howl of anguish. And what they seemed to me so rich and interesting. And and I'm not in any way suggesting she's representative of most people, but I think just listening to people talk about their voices and other people's voices is productive and interesting. And so that was all I was claiming.
That would be a fascinating qualitative study, just to do interviews purely on how people perceive their own voices and the voices around them. And I'm sure it's been done. I haven't looked into that, but I'm just thinking if I have another lifetime to live, that may be how I spend it.
Yeah.
There are so many topics in your book that are worthy of conversation. So I hesitate to choose one because they're all so fascinating. But one thing I do want to mention, something that was very helpful, was learning about the ancient Greek culture having voice teachers, and there being 3 different kinds of voice teachers, one for strength, one for resonance, and then the other for intonation. So like the spit and polish guy at the end, right? So I don't know. I wanted to at least make that point about Greek voice training, that voice was important to Greeks back then too. So maybe that's my better question.
Oh, I mean, not just to. I mean, I think we need to go back and learn from them because, if you think of rhetoric, how important that was, and, the Greeks taught us about rhetoric. They kind of formalized, as it were, the rules of rhetoric. And a lot of that is how you use the voice. I mean, it's inseparable from the voice quality and pitch and intonation range. I mean, all those things are intrinsic in rhetoric and in oratory. I mean, the Greeks, that of course was how you did persuade people. And the great orators, were the ones who had the capacity to use their voice really effectively. And I mean, in a way, that has become much more important because how do most people access politics and politicians these days? It's through audiovisual media. And so a politician that can't use their voice effectively is really at a disadvantage. So I think looking back at the Greeks and their attitude to voice is a really fruitful thing to do.
Yeah, and that was something that hadn't even crossed my mind. So that and many other ways, the book was very enlightening for me. Once again, many times I read it and had moments where tears would come to my eyes because it was so profound. So when you were doing your research, is there anything that just absolutely stunned you?
There were lots of things that stunned me. Okay, let me just come up with. Okay, the first was this group of speakers of the Tseltal language who have over 400 different words to describe states connected with the voice, including a particular voice when someone is talking but they desperately need to go to the bathroom. A voice, I always thought my husband would love to be able to use this one, where you say, I'm leaving now, but you're not really going to leave, because he always thinks I take so long to leave a place. Say, oh, I'm just leaving. And, you know, that particular intonation, they have a word for that. They have, you know, a word for what the voice sounds like if you're feeling very sleepy. So it seemed to me extraordinary that there was a language that had so many different words for different voices, how attuned they must be to the voice. And it made me realize how impoverished our vocabulary is about the voice. That was one thing that kind of amazed me. Another thing was a study done in Canada in which French Canadians who barely spoke English, no, I think it was the other way around. I think it was Canadians who didn't speak French were asked to listen to recordings of the voice, and the words were filtered out, and anyway, they didn't speak French, and they could guess correctly from the recordings how much education people had had from their voice alone. So what on earth were they hearing in the voice that that made them able to guess so accurately? And another study in the US of physicians, and people were, again, the words were filtered out, and they could identify accurately how many physicians had, those who had been more likely to have been sued for malpractice and negligence than those who hadn't. So what were they hearing? Were they hearing a good bedside manner? Were they hearing an attention to the patient and a careful interaction? I mean, who knows? But to think that that degree of information can be communicated non-verbally through the voice, it's just staggering. I think we haven't begun to understand what is being communicated. So all of that I found totally fascinating. But in the end, another thing that I suppose what I ended up feeling was, you know, I remember listening quite a lot to Clinton, Bill Clinton's voice, not Hillary's, but Bill, before Hillary's run at the presidency. And really, Bill Clinton has got a voice that by anyone's standards, you know, particularly when he was in campaigning mode, I mean, it's a damaged voice. You know, it's really, people with voices like that must come to you to help them, you know, to repair their voices. Such an ability. He had such an ability to communicate through his voice, the kind of I feel your pain aspect, that it was the most extraordinary asset. And what I came to realize is that actually the most important thing in a voice is vitality and aliveness and energy. And I mean, I remember at the beginning of the internet, people used to say, information wants to be free. And I always think the voice wants to be free. The voice wants to roam very broadly. When I started writing this book, I started to try and artificially lower my voice because I felt that it was a bit higher pitched than I wanted it to be. And of course, it's a disaster doing that. In fact, there was a very interesting British study that found that Margaret Thatcher was interrupted more in television interviews than other British prime ministers, obviously male ones, partly because, and that the reason for it, the researcher thought, was that she had tried to lower her voice and she'd interfered with the normal cues that you give someone that tell you that you're about to end what you're saying, like I'm lowering my voice and you will know that you can come in. And of course, she had made her voice such a kind of monotone that she destroyed those clues. And so I realized that actually the voice wants to be free. Now, as I said, my own voice has got a little bit deeper and more resonant for a variety of reasons. In fact, there's a British, a sort of very well-known British radio program called Woman's Hour, BBC program, and they had their anniversary recently. I think it was their 70th anniversary. And so they were picking programs from the past. And they picked a program that I was in. I mean, obviously not 70 years ago. I may be old, but I'm not that old. But a program that I think I was on in the 1980s. And I sound like the Queen. I sound sort of terribly upper class and kind of very high-pitched voice. My kids just fell about when they heard it. But in my voice, I think what's happened is that I feel freer in my voice. And so I feel I can take it where it wants to go. And I think that, in a way, is what we're all aiming for in voice. Not that we should all speak the same, God forbid, because the variety and diversity of voices is what's attractive, particularly in public speaking and broadcasting. I mean, I kind of feel that there is a sort of standardized, both American and British presenting voice, particularly female presenting voice. It's a very, makes me laugh actually, but it occupies a very kind of narrow bandwidth, if you like, and they're all very similar. Whereas what I like is to hear a real variety of different voices, people using their voices in different ways, and where the voice really feels like it comes from within and is going out to reach other people and is going all over the place. And then you feel that's a voice that's alive and that's an extension of the person who's speaking. And so I suppose in the end, where I came back to with the book is that we should be encouraging people and giving them the confidence to use their voice really fully, to use the full range of their voice, and to not feel they have to control their voice or to be scared their voice will control them, but to allow their voice to be as free as possible.
That's beautifully said. Yeah, I'm just stunned because that's it. And to me, it's the psychological freedom to accept who you are, even in your speaking voice or your singing voice.
Well, you've nailed it. I mean, that is it. And that's why I think that attempts to change the voice from the outside, I know they can help people gain confidence, and I'm not dismissing that at all. I mean, they have been lifesavers for people. I know, actors who've had help with their voice when they've practically, and non-actors when they've practically lost their voice, and they've been taught to use their voice better and to make their voices more resonant and to support the breath better. All these things can be invaluable. But because the voice comes from inside us, from within, it comes from a very deep psychosocial place. And I don't think you can go all the way and changing it from the outside. I think it does really reflect where you are in your life. And that's why it's such a sensitive instrument, because we are hearing things about people, not necessarily the ones they want us to hear and to see. And I think when you feel more comfortable with yourself, you are more likely to feel more comfortable with your voice.
Yep, that's it right there. And that might be a great place to stop so we don't take up too much of your time. But I do want to say thank you so much for speaking. And would you be interested in having another voice conversation in the future, should that come about?
I'd love to. I mean, it's so interesting. Of course, I'd like to spend the time asking you about your practice and what you do, because I learn a lot from it.
Well, I just, to anybody out there listening to this interview, I just strongly encourage you to go ahead and get yourself this book and enjoy it. I'm going to make a confession. It has taken me years to finish this book because it's so rich and powerful that I have to take it in small pieces and then put it down and just live with it. It's really been that impactful in my life. I'm not making that up. And if only a few more people read this book because of the interview or think about voice in a different way, then I think we've done our jobs. And on that note, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I've so enjoyed talking to you, Liz.
Absolutely.
Bye.
There's a feeling